both to Principal Wolf for the invitation to come here, Amitava for the all the work behind the scenes that I can't see him, where he was here, and oh, there he is, for all the work he's done, for that wonderful welcome, for the lovely dinner last night. But really, my most unexpected and gift already from this visit was this band, the bracelet that Marcus's 7-year-old daughter made. Apparently, kids here are making these things. And when he came out to the dinner, his daughter said, you must have said, I'm going to see a friend. And she didn't know me, but she said, give this to your friend. So I thought I'd wear it as my good luck charm tonight. Thank you. Thank her. So very glad to be here. I won't read out the entirety of what I have in front of me. It'll be too long. I'll take you through the lines of my own thoughts, through the arguments that I've been thinking about in connection with the title of this paper. But let me just begin by explaining what somebody like me, whose bread and butter is South Asian history, what somebody like me is doing, thinking about climate change in the way that I'm thinking about it. So the way I fell into the problem of climate change was through my connection to Australia. Australia was the place where I did my PhD, and my second growing up was in that country. It's kind of, I think of it as my second home. And something I discovered in Australia while I was a student in Canberra was capital N nature. I grew up in Calcutta where there's nature, but not capital N nature. And in the 2000s, there were big fires. Australia went through a 10-year drought. In 2003, Canberra got burnt very badly. About 300 homes were destroyed. And soon after, I visit Australia every year, and soon after I had a friend come to visit from Calcutta, and I wanted to take him proudly to all the nature spots, and discovered that all my favorite nature spots were completely burnt down. The animals had been burnt. There was a waterfall I loved. I couldn't go there. So I became interested in these fires and the drought, why the country was so dry, and why the drought was so prolonged. And I knew about natural bushfires in Australia, but I got interested. And soon the 2007 IPCC fourth report came out. Because of the drought, everybody was talking about climate change. It became an electoral issue. Then sort of went down as an electoral issue, but it sort of really came up in the 2007 elections in Australia. And as I began to read the science of climate change, I thought it had fascinating implications for how historians think about human beings and how historians think, period. So, going back, I've always had this interest in the question of what is history, partly because my only degree in history was my PhD. I'd never done history before. So my professor in a business school, who got me interested in history, was a historian, a Marxist historian, first gave me to read a book called What is History? E.H. Carr's book. And I used to jokingly say to him that, I was such a, or maybe not jokingly, I was such a backward student that in my life I never got beyond that question. And that has remained my question. What is history? And I thought climate change was something that was challenging my sense of what history was and how. So I'm not, when you come to climate change, when I give climate change talks, sometimes there are activists, sometimes there are others who are looking for solutions. And as a citizen, I think of solutions. But as a specialist, I'm not a specialist who can think of solutions to climate change. I read about solutions, I know about them, but that's not what I can actually think about. Nor am I an economist, nor am I a scientist. So I read these people to eventually to eventually have the kind of thoughts that I'll be sharing with you. But the gist of which is this, that the scientists are telling a story about human beings, about our past. And if this stuff is real, which I think it is, and if it gets worse, which I fear it might, then there will be a point where just as once the idea of progress was part of school children's textbooks, this will have to get into the textbooks. And at that point, it will be people like me or people trained by people like me who will tell the human story in different terms. So in some respects, what I want to share with you is really how climate change forces on us a new form of consciousness and a new perspective on being human and on the human story itself. So in a sense, what I'm talking about is a kind of the perspective you would need if you were to write a history of the present situation. So out of those kind of urgings, I wrote, I first actually wrote, because I write every year in my native language, Bengali. So my first essay was in 2008 in Bengali, and in Calcutta, and it sank like anything. Nobody took much notice. My friends at the most said, "Oh, it's interesting, we don't think like that." And then I wrote it up in English, and I sent it to an Indian well-known weekly magazine, and they returned it. They said they normally publish my stuff, but they said they wouldn't publish it. So and finally it came out in critical inquiry because I was on the board. They were looking for an essay. I had sent it to AHR, and AHR was going to publish it, and then my good friend, the editor of critical inquiry, said, we need essays, give it to us. So I kind of betrayed my AHR friends and gave it to CI. It came out, it traveled, got translated, and lately I've been having a lot of criticisms, getting a lot of criticisms from mainly in Europe, a lot in France and in other places. I'll be talking about some of the criticisms, but the talk is also implicitly a response to the criticisms I'm getting. So let me begin by saying that the popularization of the science of anthropogenic climate change, that is climate change that is induced by humans, its popularization, I think, is forcing on us, and by us I mean commentators, critics, and interested observers, an emergent form of consciousness that I think of as planetary. And I will distinguish what I'm calling a planetary form of consciousness from what you might call a global consciousness. So in many ways, many people have written about this, the global form of consciousness. One person I can think of classically in our period is, of course, Carl Schmitt's book on the nomos of the Earth, which is really a look at what happens to the Earth once Europe begins to expand and colonize places. If you think of that book, if you think of the book that Joyce Chaplin recently published on the history of circumnavigation of the planet, you can think of the last 500 years as a period of human history in which human beings have increasingly not only felt connected, but they have also felt that they live on a sphere. That's something that was like a globe, and in that sense, we've become global. And so from the stories of ships going around the Earth to the famous Earthrise picture, from a spaceship looking in, human being looking in, which actually, on which Ben Lazier wrote a very interesting essay in AHR a few years ago. You kind of think of these events as bookending a certain period in human history when we were getting connected, becoming global, and if you look at the literature, people were using planetary and global almost synonymously. Even just Carl Schmitt's own book does it. He uses the word planetary, and that's a 1950s book. But you can see that it means global. One person who actually moves away from this a little bit is really an essay among post-colonial scholars in Gayatri Spivak's, one of her essays, she has an interesting sentence, which kind of is my point of departure, where she says, the planet is the species of alterity belonging to another system, and yet we inhabit it. So the planet is a species of alterity belonging to another system, and yet we inhabit it. Now, this is a remarkably, this sentence, I don't know how much Spivak actually thought through the sentence, but the sentence spoke to me. I was, in another context, recently reading Machiavelli's book on, Discourses on Livy. And there, he's not special in saying it. He has a sentence where he says, in the beginning of the world, its inhabitants, because he's thinking about how cities were founded. Its inhabitants lived in small groups and eventually began to live in larger numbers. But in the beginning of the world, and he said they lived like beasts. So it's clear that in the beginning of the world, the inhabitants were humans, for Machiavelli. So you can see the difference between that sentence, which once seemed natural, that we are naturally inhabitants of this planet, to a sentence that says the planet belongs to a species of alterity, and yet we inhabit it. It puts a separation between the history of the planet and our inhabiting it, the fact of our inhabiting it. And this really goes to the heart of discussions about climate change and the use of the word planetary in that context. Because the people, if you think of famous scientists like Jim Hansen of NASA and Columbia, from the Goddard Space Center, or even James Lovelock of the Gaia theory. When he thought of the Gaia theory, he was actually visiting the Jet Propulsion Lab of NASA in 1966 or 65. They all came to the problem of warming of this planet because they studied warming on other planets. So Hansen was actually studying planetary warming on Venus. Lovelock was studying Mars. And Hansen actually describes how he became just curious about the question whether such warming was happening on this planet as well. So in a way, they actually come from another question, which is been quite a central question as far as I can see in planetary science, which is the question about why, of all the planets we know, this planet alone has been hospitable to life over such a long period and consistently. And that problem in the literature is called habitability problem. There is actually a book a textbook on planetary science written by one of my colleagues in geophysics, and there the expression is planetary warming. So in a sense, what we call anthropogenic global warming or climate change is only one example of the larger phenomenon of planetary warming. And my good friend now, Jan Zalasiewicz, who is a geologist at the University of Leicester, and heads up the subcommittee which is going to make a submission to the International Commission on Stratigraphy, trying to argue that the expression, the Anthropocene, that we're in a new geological age, be made official. And Jan and his colleague, they have a book called The Goldilocks Planet, which is sort of going to the Goldilocks story, and asking again the same question, why is this planet so inhabitable for life? So in a way, when people talk about planetary thinking or planetary consciousness, the scientists are actually doing interplanetary consciousness or interplanetary studies. So in a way, the basis of the science of climate change is really interplanetary studies. And therefore, you could say that when we use the word global is invested with human presence. There is no globality without human beings. There is no connected history without us getting connected. But planetary warming as such doesn't require humans. And it in a way, there's been climate change on this planet many times before humans. There's been warming of the planet, disastrous warming, many times before we came along. So in a way, that's why I go back to Spivak's sentence that the planet belongs to a species of alterity, and yet we inhabit it. So what I want to do in the talk is to show how that the climate crisis, and when you read the literature, you begin to see that the climate crisis does something that hasn't happened before. The climate crisis brings into view the collision or the running up against one another of three histories that, from the point of view of human history, are normally assumed to work at such different and distinct paces that they're treated as processes separate from one another for all practical purposes. The climate crisis, first of all, there's no climate crisis, and there's only crisis if you care about human beings and about the planet. So there's an interesting aspect that I'll go into. But assuming that there is a crisis which is shared in this room, it brings together three histories that never quite were together before: the history of the Earth system, the history of life, including that of human evolution on the planet, and the more recent history of industrial civilization, and for some, capitalism. Now, so in some ways, the sense of there being different scales involved. What I'll do in the talk is to talk about scale and us. In other words, to talk about scale of time and geological time, as well as huge spaces, as well as the question of how you reconfigure your thinking about the human in that context. So the whole clash between the normal human sense of time and much larger geological time is built into the everyday language with which we talk about climate crisis. We normally make a distinction between renewable fuels or renewable energy and non-renewable energy. Now, and that's the most ubiquitous distinction we make. So fossil fuels we consider non-renewable on our terms. And the distinction between renewable and non-renewable is completely human. And Brian Lovell, who was actually the president of the Geological Society of London and an advisor to BP, actually says in his book on the problem, he says, fossil fuels are indeed renewable if only we think of them on a scale that is completely inhuman. So I'm quoting him, 200 million years from now, a form of life requiring abundant oil for some purpose should find that plenty has formed since our times. Right? So in that sense, the climate crisis brings together a human sense of time as well as an extremely non-human sense of time. So paleoclimatologists tell a very long history when it comes to explaining the significance of anthropogenic global warming. And look at the evidence they have to dig up. So the ice core samples of ancient ice, in which they study air bubbles, that go back now 800,000 years. And when there's a lot of evidence, I'll talk about climate tipping point, evidence of previous climate change on the planet is geological. And one of the, now in the literature, well-known events they talk about, it's called PETM, the late Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum on the curve, when the temperature went up by 8 degrees Celsius over 10,000 years and caused all kinds of devastation. The evidence is geological, and actually it's geologists working for oil companies, that were one of the first groups to discuss this evidence. And that happened 55 million years ago. And then if that's kind of going back, looking forward, so my geophysicist colleague, another colleague, David Archer, has got an excellent book called, it's called The Long Thaw. And its title, looking forward, says, how humans are changing the next 100,000 years of Earth's climate. So you go back hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, and looking forward, as he explains, that there is some percentage of a tail of CO2 that almost lasts forever. So the climate crisis thus reproduces problems that we ponder on very different and incompatible scales of time. Policy specialists think in terms of years, decades, at most centuries, while politicians in democracies think in terms of their electoral cycles. Understanding what anthropogenic climate change is and how long its effects may last calls for thinking on very large scales, scales that defy the usual measure of time that inform human affairs. So here's the problem, that you actually have you're dealing with a problem that exists on a non-human scale. And the means you have for dealing with those problems necessarily are on a human scale. And that fundamentally is the problem, which means that there are aspects of the climate change problem which don't lend themselves to either politics or policy because of the scale. So David Archer actually goes to the heart of the problem when he acknowledges that the million-year time scale of the planet's carbon cycle, so there's an argument that, whatever mess we make humans of the atmosphere, the planet will clean it up through what is called its carbon cycle. But the carbon cycle takes 1 million years to complete. So even if you didn't clean up the atmosphere, didn't do anything, just, lived it up, the planet will take care of it. And Archer says that he acknowledges that the million-year timescale of the planet's carbon cycle, he says, is irrelevant for political considerations of climate change on human timescales. Yet, he insists, it remains relevant to any understanding of anthropogenic climate change, since ultimately global warming will last for as long as it takes for these slow processes to work out. So in a sense, we are, looking at the opposite of the famous 11th thesis of Marx. Marx thought that from understanding the world, you move to changed it. Now here, understanding is actually understanding that there are some aspects of the problem which are very difficult to address. They're happening on such a long scale. And what I want to do in the substance of the talk before I get to the concluding part. So I want to say that when I read the literature, I think the fact of this scalar incompatibility between what we can do and what the planet does, the fact produces what I call certain kind of rifts in the literature. In other words, almost like fault lines. And you walk on both sides because you need both sides to understand the problem. But the solutions are usually on one side. So it's like, you could call it a double consciousness, after Du Bois, or I'm just calling them rifts. And so the rifts, I'll discuss 3 rifts in the substance, and I'll just give you the bare bones of my argument here. The first rift I'll talk about is that the various regimes of probability that govern our everyday lives in modern economies now have to be supplemented by our knowledge of the radical uncertainty of the climate. So the first rift I'll talk about is probability and radical uncertainty, and I'll come to it. The second rift I'll talk about is the story of our necessarily divided human lives having to be supplemented by the story of our participation as a dominant species in the history of life on the planet. So our being divided constitutionally, I think humanity has always been a divided species amongst ourselves at the level of our consciousness. And at the same time, we have another life as a species which is long-term, not known to us except later in cognitive constructions. And the third drift is really about the question of, are we special? That question, that the planet belongs to alterity and yet we inhabit it. It's that yet question I'll come to. So let me just talk briefly about probability and radical uncertainty. So, Frank Knight was one of the founders of the Chicago School of Economics, wrote a book, one of the early books on risk and uncertainty. And interesting to go back and read that book again because he begins by saying that the ambition of economics is to acquire the precision of physics. So that, he says, I'm almost quoting verbatim, so that economics can contribute to man's mastery over nature. This is 1920-21, when I think it was a Cornell thesis that was published as the book. But the idea is that risk is basically an uncertainty you can quantify into a probability. So if you can calculate the probability, you can make policies. If you can calculate the probability of a danger happening, you can take steps. An uncertainty that you can't quantify, because it doesn't lend itself to that kind of quantification, is a radical uncertainty. So a radical uncertainty, so you can, in the risk literature, they'll talk about the maximum security principle, which is, they will talk about events that they call low probability, high impact events, like that this entire campus could go up in flames. Well, I just saw a courthouse today that goes up in flames from time to time. I'm told. Now that, not the courthouse, but here it would be a lower probability, high impact event, so you can take certain kinds of precautions. Now, in the climate literature, there's a broad division. Basically, if you think about the relationship between greenhouse gas emission and temperature rise, that relationship is not linear, it's a non-linear relationship, but broadly predictable. So if you go and read what economists write about climate change in terms of policy, and there are debates between Nordhaus and Nicholas Stern, for instance, in the debates about the discounting rate, how much we should save now for future, all of those debates, they basically go to what I call the physics of the problem. And the physics of the problem is the relationship between greenhouse gas emission and temperature going up. But there's another problem that for which the record is geological and historical, which is the problem of the climate tipping point, tipping over into something disastrous. Now, that process, you can't completely model for it as I understand it, because the tipping point itself is a process that is in part what they call stochastic, guided by probability, sort of has the nature of probability, and in part chaotic. So you can't produce a predictive model for a chaotic process. So so if you read the literature, then you'll find that the policy people basically work with the physics of the problem, with greenhouse gas and temperature. And the geologists and the paleoclimatologists emphasize the tipping point and the complete uncertainty of the tipping point, because it depends on all kinds of feedback loops, negative and positive. So the language they adopt to express urgency is, in humanist terms, completely vitalist. So they think of the climate as a live thing. And the best passage is really in a book by a Columbia scientist, Wallace Broker. In the book, he says, every now and then, nature has decided to give a good swift kick to the climate beast, talking about how tipping point has happened in the past. And the beast has responded as beasts will, violently and a little unpredictably. Computer models are certainly a valid approach, but studying how the beast has responded in the past under stress is another way to prepare ourselves for what might happen as we take a whack at it ourselves. That's the idea that has obsessed me for the past 25 years. And with each passing year, it has seemed urgent. And again, if you read Hansen will say, okay, the tipping point in the 55 million years ago event, the PETM event, happened over 10,000 years. But Hansen would always say, but climate system is not always that lethargic. Again, a vitalist metaphor. David Archer will say, it's almost alive in the way. But basically, the vitalist metaphors underline what I call the radical uncertainty of the climate beast. And so that was, for instance, the first rift. In other words, in the literature, there's a rift between what you can tell from geological evidence that you can't reproduce in a modular form and the models you can produce. And that has to do with, and the geological evidence is very long term. So that's why there's a kind of a rift between what I call the physics of the problem and the tipping point. So I'll quickly go through this. So actually, some economists actually acknowledge that cost-benefit analysis is not very good for a good way to deal with catastrophes. The only economist who actually acknowledges the tipping point problem and says we can't make a policy for it even though it's a reality is a Harvard economist called Martin Weitzman. He's the only economist who actually says in one of his pieces that if it's the truth that we can't make policy for a tipping point, then so be it. We should just acknowledge it. But normally economists talk about, So, philosopher Stephen Gardner, who's written a wonderful book on intergenerational ethics called A Perfect Moral Storm, has a whole chapter on cost-benefit analysis and its applicability to the climate change problem. But the chapter is called Cost-Benefit Paralysis because of this rift that I'm talking about. Okay, the second rift is really around the question of climate justice. Now, there's a lot of good reasons why one should talk about justice. India and China included, it takes 12 to 14 nations to emit 90% of greenhouse gases. So most of the other nations can tell these 14 nations that they bear in different degrees the historical responsibility. only 1/5 of humanity emit 90% of the greenhouse gases. The poor, because most people are poor, and the poor don't emit as much greenhouse gases as we do through our lifestyles. So there is a justice question. But here is the alterity of the planet. Sometimes when I teach this, I ask my students to do a kind of an absurd thought experiment. If you could, for instance, if you could spread throughout the world the prosperity of the Scandinavian countries, like had a tamer capitalism with a flatter income distribution curve, but everybody was prosperous. And suppose our numbers were the same, and it was based on consumption of fossil fuel, you would have a more just world, but the climate problem would be worse. Because together we would put out more greenhouse gases, because the poor would then participate in producing more greenhouse gases, which is exactly the problem with India and China going forward. It's the number of people who would be emitting, right? And because the climate doesn't care about what humans are fighting about. That's the alterity of the climate. It cares about how much greenhouse gases we put out. Now, this position, of course, produces problems for many people, because many in the literature actually argue that the climate problem is inherently a moral, political, economic problem. And it's a problem of inequality that causes it. Now, I'm not talking about, there's no dispute, at least in my head, that industrial civilization works as an efficient cause for climate change in an Aristotelian sense. But there are other long-term factors, much longer-term factors that come into it. So that's why my argument is that the scale of capitalism, which is at the most 500 years, or looking forward another 100 years, is not enough to capture the problem of what we face. But in the literature, so the climate justice question actually was inaugurated in 1991 by two Indian environmental activists, one of them dead now, respected people, Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan, who together published a book called on global warming, and the subtitle was Environmental Colonialism in Action. So they saw it as part of Western greed, that basically the developed countries had hogged all the carbon sink of the available world. And therefore, it was that book that first argued that we should look at per capita emissions. And that was adopted in the Kyoto Protocol, and that has generally global warming in an unequal world. Now, so from that book actually started another history which I'll pick up on, which is a suspicion of the category humanity, and therefore a suspicion of the expression anthropogenic or human-induced. They would rather say it's not human-induced, it's induced by these either wealthy human beings or wealthy countries, and therefore the person they were arguing with was actually Gus Peth, who was then the founding director of the World Resources Institute, and had published a book on global warming saying it's humanity's crisis. And the leaflet that the Indians produced was actually arguments saying, no, it's not humanity's crisis, you guys are responsible for it, and we should look at per capita emissions. That was adopted. Interestingly, however, what I want to say here is that the per capita figure actually hides a very interesting problem, which came up in the Indian Parliament in 2009. Our environment minister made himself somewhat unpopular by saying to the nation that the per capita works to our advantage because A, we couldn't make people prosperous, and B, we couldn't control the population problem. So we have a lot of poor people, so the per capita looks nice. But actually you're trying to make a virtue out of two failures, which didn't make him popular. But the per capita problem, the figure is interesting because it actually hides, both acknowledges and then disavows the question of history of population. Now, and then there are two things one is looking at. So one is looking at the history of the number of human beings on the planet. So if you look at that, there's no question that there's a relationship between industrial civilization and the numbers going up. And actually there's a relationship between fossil fuel and the numbers going up through artificial fertilizers, irrigation, electricity for irrigation, and all of the motor pumps you have to operate to get groundwater up. So there's no question that we owe the growth in human population to industrial civilization and fossil fuel. Secondly, there's been a geologist in Duke, Peter Haff, has recently written a very interesting paper showing that actually you can't sustain a population of 7 or 10 billion without what he calls the technosphere. In other words, without modern technology being part of the life of even the poorest person on the planet. the fact that you can rush food from one place to another. In fact, every container that carries things from one country to another, it has a ballast. It's actually they put water underneath to balance the container, and every ballast carries. I was looking at the figure somewhere. Maybe some 50,000 species from one part of the world to another. So basically, humanity is making a cocktail of the distribution of species. But the point is that so there's this argument that if you actually didn't have modern technology, human population would crash. And the figure he gives is 12 million. But the more interesting problem with the population is not just the size, but also the distribution of human beings throughout the planet. And the reason why it becomes important was that in the past cases of climate change, when global warming happened, one way that different species have dealt with climate change is by migrating to places that are more habitable. And now the problem is that we stand in the way. We are everywhere. So you have to think about the distribution of population. And that is much older process than capitalism, because the Pacific were the last place on the planet to be colonized by humans. And that process was finished about 4,000 years ago. The other problem that you have with the distribution of population is that not only different species will have trouble migrating. If the climate problem gets worse, human beings will want to migrate. And existing human groups will want to stop other human beings from migrating into their territories in numbers that they can't control. So our distribution is actually a problem for us. But the point I want to make is that the per capita figure reminds us that there is both a very long-term history, much longer term than capitalism, and the history of industrial civilization working together to produce what I call the second drift in the literature. The third drift develops around the question, are we really special? Now, the reason why this comes up, are we really special, is because of the claim that we actually make on the planet. So the Canadian scholar, actually, Vaclav Smil, who's written many books on energy problems and the biosphere, one of the great scholars. So Smil actually shows, he's taken a measure, the most objective criterion of all collective weight. So considered simply as body mass, we humans now bulk up to about a third of terrestrial vertebrate body mass on the planet. So we're a third of the vertebrate body mass. Most of the other two-thirds, by the same measure, comprise what we keep to eat. So cows, pigs, sheep, and such. So basically what we are and what we keep to eat makes up virtually, more than 90%. And it says 95%. It says something under 5%, and perhaps as little as 3% is now made of genuinely wild animals, the cheetahs, elephants, antelopes, etc. Whereas earlier in the Quaternary, the last 2 million years, humans were just one of 350 large vertebrate species. And actually the vertebrate biomass has not gone down because, as my friend Zalasiewicz says, that humans have become very good, firstly, at increasing the rate of vegetable growth by conjuring nitrogen from the air and phosphorus from the ground, and then directing that extra growth towards its brief stopover in our captive beasts, so that extra growth goes into cattle and beef and pigs and things, right? And thence to us, so that the total vertebrate biomass has increased by something approaching order of magnitude above natural levels. So this actually raises a very interesting question. On the one hand, so when people have looked at, when did really the spurts of greenhouse gas emissions occur? There's a debate in the literature between Bill Ruddiman and others who argue that the so-called Anthropocene began as early as the agricultural revolution. But Paul Crutzen and others date it from the Industrial Revolution, and they think it got a huge spurt after the Second World War, when basically the consumerist capitalist economy began. Now, on the other hand, they give statistics for all kinds of growth, including growth of McDonald's restaurants. But interestingly, this period of growth of consumption also, as a human historian, I have to remember that this is the period in which consumer durables come into Western middle-class households, washing machines, refrigerators, and they come as instruments liberating emancipation to women. And this is the period in which decolonization happens. The dams are being built. Nehru says dams are India's temples. Nasser actually says that the modern poets of Egypt are the engineers, right? And from there to present-day consumption in India, for instance, the penetration of cell phone and the pride with which an ordinary Indian will hold up their cell phones. I mean, purely in terms of human history, there's been a kind of, in the history of consumption, there has been a sort of justice done. In the sense that people who could not consume before, given all the poverty, now consume more. So this question comes up, a moral question comes up, which is something like a question that Europeans ask themselves throughout the history of colonization. So Europeans were quite special and self-deluding in constantly asking themselves, by what right do I take somebody else's land? Right? And the Portuguese asked it, the Spaniards asked it, then the English asked it, the French. Now, similarly, this question comes up in the literature, by what right do we claim so much of the biosphere for ourselves? Are we special? And again, when you look at the history of this question, are we special? The Oxford moral philosopher John Broome, who actually worked for IPCC and was one of the authors of one of the volumes, in his book on ethics for a warming planet, he actually acknowledges this question by saying, so what is, if we are not special, what is nature good for? I mean, why do we value nature? If we value nature for us, then whether we are special or not, that's the use that nature has for us. So he actually says that climate change raises this moral, ultimate question, what is the value of nature? And he then says, I can't answer it. But I will tell you that nature is valuable for us because it's useful for us. And he gives a whole lot of, we go to nature because the river provides power, whatever, clean water, etc., etc. Now, the question is the good of the people an ultimate good? And this idea, again, when you look at the idea of history of the idea of are humans special, again, it has a long history. I mean, I quoted Machiavelli, but actually, my hunch is that if you look at the history of religions, then all the religions that Jaspers called axial religions, which created transcendental God, and I think, and these are all after the urban revolution in human history. So the moment we created transcendental God, in whatever version, Hindu, Christian, Islamic, we're always special to a transcendental God. Whereas if you go back and read about the totemistic religions, the more ancient religions of the world, Aboriginal religions, African religions, I mean, Durkheim, in discussing totemism, mentions how in totemistic conceptions, the human is always half animal. So in a way, when you go back to more ancient religions, humans are part of the animal planet. You're not sort of sitting outside the box watching it. You're kind of in there to eat them and to be eaten by others, right? And so in a way, this question raises, are we special? And this is a question that has troubled environmental philosophers who have talked about anthropocentrism and non-anthropocentrism. But the most radical formulation of this question I found was in James Lovelock's book, either The Vanishing Face of Gaia, one of those books, where he has a sentence where he says, if you want to think about the health of the planet, by which he means continuation of life on it, stop putting humans first. And if you think of history of political philosophy, if you think of Marxism, I mean, we tend to put humans first. And somebody interviewed him on this, and you can watch that interview on YouTube, on this question. What does it mean not to stop put humans first? And this is where there's a serious rift. He actually says, there are too many of us on the planet. And so the interviewer, BBC interviewer, says, how many do you think there should be? And he says, not more than 1 billion at the present level of civilization. So he said, do you welcome a crash in human population? And he says, no, it's terrible. But if it happens, it will be good for the planet. Now, It's an extreme position. But you can see that he is actually completely committed to thinking the alterity of the planet. The planet belongs to a species of alterity, and yet we inhabit it. Now, again, this I see as a rift in the literature. So on the one hand, the inescapable question of on what grounds do we claim so much of the biosphere? Are we special? David Archer will tell you there's no way we can be special. The planet was not made for us. Complex creatures like us can only come at the end of a long process of evolution. So it was not like the planet was waiting there. If you read commentaries on Islam, like Fazlur Rahman's book who used to teach in my university on Islam, and he has an very interesting chapter discussing why Allah is called Rahman. And he discusses, the term Qadar, Allah's measuring out things. And ultimately the argument is that there is, he is merciful because he has stocked the world with provisions. And that's not just an Islamic argument. You get a version of it in a certain kind of Hinduism, certain kinds of Christianity, environmental people always quote. So that on the one hand there is a long history of considering ourselves special, even in a spiritual way, even in through religions, and this new emergent consciousness of which I find Lovelock to be a principal bearer, where he is saying that so many people are not good for the planet. And it really shakes you up, because one of the values with which one approaches climate change is if you care, I'm starting from the position that I care for fellow human beings. Lovelock is starting from the position that he cares for the planet. Now, what does caring for the planet mean? We don't know. Bruno Latour, who has just given these wonderful lectures on the idea of the Gaia, goddess, and the intellectual origins of it, going through sort of Hume's natural religion, has produced a play in which he is kind of really asking for a secular religion and a secular goddess called Gaia, and for humans to spend. But it is a very interesting rift, what I call rift, a fault line, emerging on the question of our specialness. So with that, then I come to the last, to the concluding section of my. So when I published my 2009 essay, one of the people who criticized it, and one of the earliest to criticize, I think in 2010, was the theorist Slavoj Žižek. So Žižek, in his book Living at the End Times, has a critique of my 2009 essay in which I was saying we have to consider the history of capitalism and this history of much larger processes together. And Žižek began by saying, in his critique, he said, responding to my proposition that we needed to think deep history of the species and the much shorter history of capital together, he wrote, I'm quoting, "Since the fate of the whole life on earth, that is the whole, hinges on what goes on in what was formerly one of its parts, that is, the socio-economic mode of production of the species on earth, we also have to accept the paradox that the key struggle is the particular one. One can solve the universal problem of the survival of human species only by first resolving the particular deadlock of the capitalist mode of production. The key to the ecological crisis does not reside in ecology as such." And then he goes on to say, of course, the natural parameters of our environment. So I actually had a sentence where I said, there are certain natural parameters of human existence. And whether you go for capitalism or socialism, you have to respect them. And since then, actually, a bunch of scientists have come up with 9 such parameters where they think there should be a compact among human beings, that we are not going to cross those barriers. But anyway, he writes, he says, of course, the natural parameters are independent of capitalism or socialism. They harbor a potential threat to all of us, independently of economic development, political system, etc. So he, having agreed with me, he then says, but however, the fact that stability has been threatened by the dynamic of global capitalism nonetheless has a stronger implication than the one allowed by Chakrabarty. In a way, we have to admit that the whole is contained by its parts, that the fate of the whole, life on earth, hinges on what goes on in what was formerly one of its parts. That is, in other words, capital now includes the whole. The dynamic of analytic of capital has to include the whole of the earth. So, just to finish off from there, let me just quickly, I'll just read the last. So I'll just read a few propositions. First, take the idea that freedom and justice that saturate most human narratives of history, ideas of freedom, they take those ideas, and it is deeply ironic that what enabled human beings to curtail the use of massive slave or bonded labor needed to build very large structures, such as the pyramids or the Taj Mahal, was the discovery of cheap energy in the form of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels contributed to human sense of freedom in history. Profligate use of these fuels, however, is now understood to be at the root of the present climate crisis, threatening human futures on the planet. Even if we assume that all will be well in the end, and that humans will make a smooth transition to renewables, energy is more likely than not to be dearer than at present. So if there's a close connection between consumption expenditure of energy and the exercise of our freedoms, then our freedoms are going to be more expensive and therefore relatively scarce. A just distribution of freedom as a scarce resource will call for significant reordering of social hierarchies and will thus require us to reimagine not only society but our freedoms as well. Secondly, take the case of those, like Zizek, who blame the climate crisis solely on the capitalist mode of production. Climate change, they argue, results from the unstoppable tendency of capitalism, loosely speaking, to accumulate wealth. But if we accept this widely popular position, something very interesting happens to the analytical framework with which social scientists usually analyze capital. That the logic of capitalist production leads to further accumulation of capital, and thus to the pursuit of never-ending growth, is not in doubt or question. But climate change is not a problem that could have been either recognized or named or even predicted within the traditional analytics of capital alone. For to know what climate change is and to be able to measure it, you need much more than the theories of political economy, geological and paleoclimatological knowledge of this and other planets, the knowledge of climate modelers, instruments to measure true trace gases and temperature, including those needed for the extraction of ice core samples, and so on. In other words, while some may see in the dynamics of capitalism the chief causes of human-induced climate change, it still remains a problem that, unlike many other crises of capitalist accumulation, including some environmental ones, climate crisis could not have been predicted from within the frameworks of political economic analysis by themselves. What does it mean? It means that political economic knowledge about capital alone does not equip one to understand the relationship between the capitalist mode of production and global warming. One has to get beyond the historical life of capital, both backwards and forwards, to understand that the planet has seen planetary warming long before there were even human beings, that the logic of capitalist accumulation may now have interfered with much longer-term processes relating to the history of the earth and the role of life in that history. In other words, the present crisis reveals our available analytics of capital not to be unnecessary, but insufficient. We have to think of the history of capital and a much more expanded history of the Earth's system of life on it at the same time. And finally, take the question of climate justice in the face of this crisis. There is surely a case for justice among nations and classes, for reasons I've spelled out. So one could legitimately argue that the crisis must be met in a way that addresses this uneven responsibility. Yet think about the problem we face here. The calendar of justice among nations, groups, and individuals is an open one. One does not know when the world will be just. But the IPCC calendar for global action on climate change, so that dangerous warming can be avoided, is a short and finite calendar. Our budgeted emission of greenhouse gases should come to an end by 2040. So they actually give you a figure that human beings can only emit so much greenhouse gases by 2040 if you want to avoid dangerous climate change. That is, if you don't want the temperature to go beyond 2 degrees. Now suppose that for an indefinite period into the future, unions, nations do not find a way to come together, and some parties hold out with good reasons on issues of justice. What would be the result? Given that climate change, while affecting all, will adversely affect the poor of the world more than the rich, those feeling unjustly treated today will most likely find themselves in a world that is even less just. For climate change will have made their situation much worse. This is not an argument for not fighting for justice, but instead a suggestion that global unity on fighting climate change actually contributes to justice. Here the expression, the Anthropocene, reflects an interesting problem of nomenclature. Many are suspicious of the category humanity, and hence resist notions of human-induced and anthropogenic climate change. For the term human, they argue, hides the very different kinds of responsibility that the rich and the poor bear for the current crisis. Yet climate change, whoever bears the responsibility for it, is by its very nature everybody's problem. So we all share the planet's climate. Shared but differentiated responsibility. This was a slogan actually coined by Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan in that book, which Kyoto actually adopted. The shared but differentiated responsibility, how some activists put it. The word differentiated addresses the point that we are not all equally responsible. But why then is the responsibility shared at all? In what way could we all be responsible? Is there any name for this horizon of commonality that the word shared points to? Isn't it humanity, that much despised term, at some other level? Climate change thus raises the issue of a shared history, but we do not yet have a name for the subject of that history, a name that would not be mired in the ideological trappings of the term humanity. Thank you.
We have some time for questions.
Sure. Yeah.
We do, though, I'll recognize you if you raise your hand, and then we have to get a microphone to you so that it can be properly recorded. Because we put all of this on the web now. Follow either electronically. Questions? Comments?
Marcus.
Thanks a lot, Dipesh. Great stuff. My question for you is quite hopefully simple, in that can we afford for Zizek to be wrong? I understand his criticism of you, and he wants to resolve the climate of crisis through the crisis of capitalism. But if we reject what he's saying, are we pushing ourselves into a world in which there is no way in which we can deal with this? Is that what you're suggesting? Because for whether he's right or wrong, the limits of what we can do, presumably, is to try and produce ourselves differently, to become differently modern in a way that resolves the idea of the accumulation of capital, to constantly scour the world and commodify it and produce it and leverage this incredible powder keg of climatic change. So can we afford for Zizek to be wrong?
No, I was always saying it's not a matter of rejecting it. It's a matter of what do you supplement. See, if you say that the analytics of capital already include the whole, the history of life on this planet, you've already shifted your perspective. You know, that category capital, which already includes the history of the life on this planet, which is what he's arguing, right? It was not Marx's category. So in a way, he has kind of acknowledged my ground, but he doesn't want to say that he's acknowledged my point. But the point is more complex than that, because this is where I kind of personally beg to differ from James Lovelock's position. I can't adopt it as a human being. The very fact that population grew at a certain point, whether you adopted socialism or capitalism, I would argue it didn't matter. If you have to sustain a large population, you are into the logic of accumulation, into the logic of saving. The reason is simple. Because you can't save people from famine in one part of the world, right? Or scarcity, if you can't rush food and help to that part of the world. So actually, this geologist's idea, Peter Haft's idea that we can sustain such a big population only because we are technologically connected, is completely true, and that locks us into a system of growth and accumulation. So Lovelock is kind of cruelly right that it's very hard to break out of that logic. So even if you say you give up capitalism, but when you read books on energy, people who write about energy and who write about most things I've read about energy suggest that even if there was not a climate problem, once the age of cheap fossil fuel is over, energy is going to get dearer, right? Even with non-conventional oil. If energy gets dearer, eventually the world will become more fragmented. It will just be too expensive to move things around. Yeah. So in some ways, even if there wasn't a climate change, economies will become more localized in that sense, right? So in a way, this period of connected history, globalization, has to do with also our creating a world in which the population would increase, even if people are poor. So the poor actually participate in the technological condition of the world. And how to get out of it is a completely legitimate question, what one does to get out of it. But what I'm saying to Zizek is that if you argue that in order to understand capital today, you have to understand how capital itself includes the whole of the history of life on the planet, right? That capital is the threat to other species. You are already reading the literature that I'm reading. So, whereas if you read standard histories of capitalism, they don't read evolutionary biology. You know, Marx was not interested in the history of life on the planet in the same way. So, in a way, what he's done, he's shifted his ground, he's shifted the understanding of capital. And he precisely, for me, he's a symptom of that new consciousness that I was talking about, the planetary consciousness. So no, I'm not rejecting what he says. I'm simply saying that on the one hand he's saying we must fight capital, but his definition of capital in that sentence is very different from Marx's understanding of capital. And that I welcome. I only wish he would acknowledge it. You know?
Hi, Dr. Chakrabarty. Wait, does this work? Okay. So I am a fourth-year student, and I've never heard something more interesting lecture that has asked me to ask more questions. So I don't know as much as you, obviously, but I had a question. So you mentioned that you played a hypothetical scenario with your students where you assumed that every country or every person enjoyed the same type of standard of living, or
similar, let's say,
similar,
a more humane capitalism
to the Scandinavian countries, for example.
Right.
And that would result in an even worse climate problem than we're facing
if
right
the
now.
population was the same and the fossil fuel was the base for it.
Yeah. So if you were to play the same game, would the standards change? So instead of everyone having a similar standard of living, if everyone of the same population was living in a way that our either economic footprints or our climate change problems were more mitigated, what does a world like that look in terms of wealth? Or
sorry, the last bit again?
What does a world like that look like?
No, you know, it's one of the things that actually scientists associated with IPCC say, looking forward to the next few decades, you know, so, you know, I was talking about radical uncertainty. So they make the very interesting point that they say, you know, as scientists, we know how much greenhouse gas may be emitted. We know the scenarios, right? And they say the most uncertain factor in the whole equation are human beings. You don't know what human beings will do. And there's always room for imagination and leadership. So unlike going down the Zizek path, what I would want to supplement it was saying, I mean, somebody from India, like me, knowing that there was a man called Gandhi who once lived in that land, and whom the Indian government is fond of quoting, whatever the subject. The white paper begins with Gandhi. And so they actually, the Indian white paper on climate change begins by saying, Mahatma Gandhi said, there's enough for everybody's need, not enough for everybody's greed, whatever. And they misquote him. I've actually checked the original sentence, they misquote him. But anyway, they also misquote him regularly. But I'm just saying, I kind of think, look at that country. Most people are poor. They say the middle class is 300 million. The middle class, not everybody in that 300 million can buy at dollar prices. It's only a minuscule percentage of even that middle class that buys at dollar prices. So it's a population where the majority are not actually yet invested in the logic of capitalism or the civilization as we are. You know, like my pension funds are part of the stock market. You know, they don't have pension funds, these poor people. And even in that country, there's not a confidence in the middle class to say that we will have some other kind of development. Or in China, you know, so in a way, there's a peculiar logic in going back to Marx's point. You know, what I find interesting is that when I say that this is a crisis for everybody in different ways, differentially, I get the criticism that it's really a crisis for the poor, and I'm making a flawed argument. But on the other hand, the argument always is that the Americans should reduce their consumption. So I say to these people, but if by your own understanding, this is not Americans' problem, the problem is yours, right? I mean, the Americans are having it quite good. Why should they suddenly sacrifice? Are they altruistic? I mean, if the Americans have to sacrifice, they have to sacrifice either because it's in their interest to sacrifice, or because somebody has set a nobler example of another kind of civilization, right? So if you go back to the colonial period, Indians were wonderfully creative in thinking up in utopian fashions, alternatives. And Indians are not alone. I mean, there's a whole history of both in North America and in Europe and other places of communitarian movements that have actually looked at other kind of other ways of collectivities. Now, what I'm agreeing with in the IPCC scientists is that there is, I mean, the most radical uncertainty is in the realm of human imagination and leadership, and you never know. I mean, there might come a leader, a charismatic leader in some country who kind of helps that people set up an alternative model. Once somebody does it with courage and with conviction, and is not locked into this logic of wars and growths and these things, maybe a lot of the people in the world will be interested. So one can imagine these things, but it needs leadership and imagination.
I wonder if you could speak a little more about the big scale picture of how global warming happened before a few times, and why you suggest there's an incompatibility, that we need to understand that. Do you mean that we need to understand that to tackle the problem now? I'm wondering if you told me that. But supposing there are a lot of other planets that we just don't know that have gone through cycles
Planetary
of
warming.
change too. Does it matter that we don't know about those?
No, I'm just saying that if the science of planetary warming wasn't available, then there would not be a climate change problem scientifically defined.
Oh, so our knowledge is based on this.
Our knowledge is based on planetary studies. So the people who actually defined the greenhouse gas problem, some of them actually used to work on other planets. And so the general expression is not global warming. The general expression is planetary warming, right? And
No, those it might not be a cycle.
no, see, no, there's an older question. There's an older question that, surely goes back to Carl Sagan's days, and even, in fact, Carl Sagan's wife was a co-author with James Lovelock, a estranged wife. This question as to why Mars was so cold and Venus was so hot, while the Earth seemed right for habitation by life. This is an old question. And it comes out of, so you can only have that question if you compare planets. You can't ask that question if this is the only planet you study, right? And so that's the Goldilocks planet problem, right? And it's some of those people then, not all, but some of them then shifted their attention. Among climate scientists for a long time, even up to Second World War, the generally favored theory was of global cooling. Global warming is a more recent theory. It's only in the 50s that they began to talk about this possibility of global warming. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I'm Mark Vardy, a PhD student in sociology here. Just to return to the question of scale, in relation to the first rift you mentioned and the uncertainty there, a lot of the scale that you were talking about, from my understanding, was more in terms of like the long term and trying to recapture a bit of a sense of history that exceeds our present limitations. But what about scale sort of turning the other way into the more immediate short term? Some of the stuff that I've been reading around uncertainty and the question of tipping points and whatnot has to do with this idea that transitions between climatic regimes can actually happen much more abruptly
Yeah.
than previously thought, and that goes back to the work of Wally Broker, who you mentioned, and whatnot. So I'm just wondering if this is something that you've addressed either in this paper or elsewhere. Not so much the question of a long-term scale, but the shortening of scale in a sense.
Okay, so let me first just say briefly what for me was invested in the long term, and then come to the question of the short term. So I think one, that human populations have been putting pressure on other species has been visible in, people have been talking about it for a while. One of the ways in which, if the climate change gets worse, we affect history of life on the planet is really by making the oceans more acidified. And that will change a lot of maritime biology, right? And therefore, the question of climate change, which is what paleoclimatologists study in order to understand, and the question of our being a dominant species that can contribute to the 6th largest extinction of species. It's not happening yet, but there's a possibility that, so I kind of was thinking how there is a history of us as species, and there's a history of climate change that's sort of coming together. And the climate crisis includes, it entails that interspecies history, right? In that sense, the longer term. But you're totally right, and that's what I've learned from the literature, is that radical shift, but partly radical shifts in local regional climates can happen, and been happening. But also radical shifts in planetary climate can also happen quickly. But there's another sense in which I think the short term is extremely interesting. So sometimes even people who don't accept the climate change problems as defined by scientists and say, I don't believe in that climate change thing, right? But they will even sometimes talk about the effects of climate change in their lives. Like the winters can get more expensive, summers can get more expensive. So that actually leads to many possible concrete steps that one has to take. You're not going to shift immediately. So assuming, say, if you assume pessimistically that the climate crisis will get worse in 3 or 4 decades, let's say, I actually see a lot of short-term changes taking place. And the vision is infinite. The vista is infinite there, because from questions of climate refugees, to questions of energy conservation, what you do, there's a whole lot of things that people can do. But what I was trying to say was that climate crisis, by definition, is a large-scale crisis. That's why it's a planetary crisis. Because when they say that this age is of the Anthropocene, or human beings have become a geophysical force, what they mean is that we have the same kind of impact on the planet's climate as a whole as the orbital cycles and the wobbles in the orbital cycles have, right? The Milankovitch cycle. So what the scientists define is a much larger scale problem. And I was trying to argue in my original article that basically, because these large-scale questions are now questions that have to do with what humans do, both in the short term and in the long run, that what has shifted is our perspective on human history. So that's why I'm saying that if you think of me as sharing with you a certain kind of fragment of the history of the present, then the available perspectives on human action, agency, sovereignty, with which we write history, don't seem adequate to write that history. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. I guess since this is sort of if this is a history talk, I wonder what role do historians have in contributing to this. And I wonder, when we think about what you said about are we special, but also about scales, does one of the things that come up is that when we think about Zizek talking about capital as the history of the part of the whole.
Yeah.
If it's not that historians have a contribution to maybe make to rethink the way we talk about human history to actually decentralize that capitalist history, to maybe decentralize, to remove that part from the central importance of the whole? Is this not part of a larger part of a decolonizing or a colonial history?
Look, I mean, what I said doesn't invalidate your thesis or, the book I've just finished. History as usual can go on. I mean, there's no problem with that. But what I'm saying is, that's why I said this is the history of the present. Going forward, history will be different. I mean, and of even looking backwards. So, for instance, the kind of work that Paul Word and people are doing, calculating energy consumption of different social structures, or looking at sailing ships to the transition to steamships, and the increasing size of sailing ships, and therefore plotting the rate of energy consumption in different societies. So defining societies more by their energy consumption than the way we've defined them as capitalist or this or that. So in those senses, I think the social theories may eventually change. And again, if Zizek is right, if the analytics of capital has to include the history of life, which means a Marxist might then have to read biology more seriously, right? Eventually, I think there'll be shifts in the frameworks we use, but obviously a lot of history can be written without the climate change problem. I mean, particularly for people who are looking at earlier periods. But some historians, for instance, my young friend, British historian Frederick Johnson, I mean, what he is doing in his current work is he's looking at the origins of, for instance, population debates, from Malthus, Jevons and these people, and looking at whether or not the population question and the economic logic of accumulation are deeply connected in history. In other words, see, one argument that sometimes Marxists make is that the logic of accumulation and increasing growth, never-ending growth, is only intrinsic to capitalism. But one could argue that if you opted for an industrial form of society, and if you opted for the sustenance of a large population, the question of accumulation would immediately come. In other words, the question of savings for tomorrow, for bad days, for a connected world. So in some ways you can go back and rethink those histories. The most radical suggestion I had was, of course, I gave a lecture at Harvard on a similar question a couple of 3 weeks ago. And there was a biologist in my audience, Jim Mullett, and he wrote me a long letter and eventually wrote a long email, and in which one of the things he suggested, he said, you can also look at capitalism through natural selection theory. Now, I don't know how he was thinking about it, but one way one could think about it is, for instance, when evolution happens, a species never acts as a species, right? It's members of species that do certain things. And the more successful members propagate more, right? So if you imagine a species like humans, where we have a capacity to learn from one another and emulate one another, and it's entirely possible in the history of a species that some members do certain things blindly, pragmatically, because it helps them to either live more comfortably or make more money, whatever, lord it over some more people, and other members of the species learn from that. It's entirely possible that leadership of some members can lock that species into a logic of extinction. I mean, that has happened with other species. But at the same time, as I said, because it's a question of leadership, it's also possible that some other members may do something else, right? And that might be the more successful model. So, but it is an interesting insight. He just wrote a quick paragraph, and I thought, but one day these things may happen. One day we may read both Darwin and Marx, they're just two names to sort of describe two streams of literature, and we might find ways of thinking them together.
Time for one more question. This side of the room,
Adnan.
Well, thank you very much. Mine's a more narrow, I guess, professional sort of historian's question. which is just that the problem of scales that you mentioned. I'm interested in the way in which you would bring them into interaction, and particularly to explain the kinds of things historians are always interested in, causality and the like. What I was thinking about on a smaller scale, something that was sort of similar to the problem that you're dealing with, was Brauddel's History of the Mediterranean, and the way in which he tries to include an ecological kind of description, then a sort of human, cultural, and society, wheels of commerce, capitalism, and then political events and affairs and wars as three distinct temporalities that he identified. But what I think was, and he thought that was a significant social, theoretical, and historical, kind of advanced or theoretical contribution to think of temporality. But what I found was difficult was what wasn't so successful was the interaction between those scales and actually producing explanations. So I'm wondering how you will be trying to wrestle with that, even though you've got a much bigger scale to deal with.
And so here's a kind of three-step answer. One is, so Braudel has had some ambitions. He's obviously a great historian, and you can only be stunned by his achievement. But at the same time, he had certain ambitions which I don't share. So when he gave his inaugural address in 1950 at the College of France, he stated very clearly that his ambition was eventually to write a history in which individuals didn't matter. And I remain, as a historian, deeply of E.P. Thompson's school. And to me, individuals matter. But I actually did discuss Braudel a little bit in my 2009 essay, which partly to say that for him, what he considered the environmental factor, or the seas, the rhythm of the seas, or the ocean, the wind, and all of those things, basically he considered them to be cyclical, right? Whereas what we're dealing with in climate change is not a cyclical thing. And thirdly, I want to say, the climate change problem is not, it doesn't come out of environmental historical problems. Because the climate change problem has at its core the alterity of the planet. Environmental histories have at their core the human propensity to mess up our environment. So in the environmental histories, they speak of a curve called the Kuznets curve, which they've taken from economics, where basically looking at the curve from where you are, if these are two axes, you kind of pollute and make a mess of things as you industrialize. Then you reach a plateau, and then you have the wherewithal with which to clean up, right? That's the Kuznets curve. And whereas for greenhouse gas emission, there is no Kuznets curve. The more, you might have very clean atmosphere in terms of normal pollution concepts, but you might still have a lot of gas up there. In these kind of, the alternative, James Lovelock talks about in the history of life, when life was basically nitrogen-based, the creation of oxygen in the atmosphere was toxic. And it pushed those forms of life deep into the earth and into deeper recesses. And then oxygen-bearing forms of life dominated. And he kind of describes that as a crisis for certain forms of life, toxicity. Oxygen is toxic. So in some ways, I'll be, in a few days, I'll be speaking at the American Environmental Historians Conference, because they thought that I'd kind of strayed into their turf. And so they've set up a panel to discuss my 2009 essay and to criticize me. And I've agreed to go and respond, but I want to tell them that climate change was never your turf. You can come into it. You are as welcome to come into it as I am, I think. Because climate change belongs to another order of problems. It's not a continuation of environmental history, though understandably environmental historians are taking an interest in it. The fourth thing I want to say is that the historian's role. So in effect, I didn't say this clearly, didn't bring it up, and it goes back to your question too, Patrick. So there are historians like David Christian, who thinks we should be doing big histories. I feel that we are not qualified as researchers to do big history because the methods are different. I mean, I don't know how to take ice core samples, or measure temperature, but I feel that what this science is doing, because the claim is that this climate crisis is anthropogenic in nature, what they're doing is shifting my perspective on the meta-narratives of history. So for instance, I think it's completely made the idea of human freedom, which is so central to even somebody like Amartya Sen, ironical. Like, if the freedoms are energy intensive, as I was saying, like if we have an energy transition to renewable, then energy becomes dearer, then freedoms will become dearer. So it kind of challenges the deep set assumptions from which we've written the history of rights, we've written the history of all the emancipatory narratives that underlie a lot of the history as usual that we write. It interestingly sort of challenges those ideas, right? Yeah. Thank you. Oh, there's one last question. Okay, it's all right.
Hi, so my name is Peter, and I'm actually a life science student. I'm in second year, very little experience in history, notwithstanding a grade 10 Canadian course. But so my question's a bit more general. I think the talk as a whole was phenomenal. There's a plethora of concerns and issues that you really have to think about. And what kind of brought me here was my potential previous readings related to divestment within a student context.
Yeah.
And after this talk, it really made me think that divestment in an institutional context is just a micro level discussion of some of the points we talked about here today. And there's a group at Yale you might be familiar with a pro-divestment campaign, and then there's also an anti-divestment campaign. And I think after today, it really made me think the answer isn't as simple as that. There's so many different things to concern, points of privilege, historical context, the future. And so to say, is that good or not, I think is an oversimplification. And so that brings me to my question, which is, what is the importance of a youth voice continuing forward, involvement on that front? And right now, I know it's a very academic discussion.
No, I think it's a very legitimate question. Yeah. Have you finished?
Oh, yeah, no, but and that's a norm that as we age, we gain more wisdom, and we're able to discuss things more. But I think
you become Homo sapien, but it doesn't help. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. No. Well, the divestment question is very. Bill McKibben runs a whole campaign on. So here is the climate problem is addressable on paper very easily. So Jim Hansen says, now it's agreed the most offending fuel is coal. Coal is the most offending fuel. Jim Hansen says we just should stop producing coal. That's what we have to do. Just stop producing coal. Bill McKibben going around the world saying to people, look, there will come a time when governments will be forced to basically stop producing coal. So every money that you've invested in coal mines, you won't be able to realize that money. So why don't you divest now and invest in something else? So there is a move, and I think it's an important move. I'm not denying its value. But at the same time, again, as you said, the world is complex. So India and China are both heavily dependent on coal, right? So, and the debate among economists is, they would always tell you, look, there's a climate tipping point, and there's an economic tipping point. If the economy tips over, then there's a lot of misery to a lot of people. And therefore, we have to keep going and think. I have a friend who works for a very big mining company as their chief economic advisor. A really big, one of the world's biggest. And he told me that they also fear that this point might come when governments say, so they have to think about the portfolio of their investment accordingly. So they're also planning for these sorts of contingencies. So I think the demand for divestment from coal particularly, in theory, is a good demand. But you have to you come up against the realities of places like India and China. And their argument that they have to pull this millions or billions out of poverty, which argument is actually used by American coal companies. So there's a peculiar way in which need and greed arguments come together. So suddenly the coal companies become altruistic and very interested in letting the poor come up. They said, how can we deny coal to the poor people of the world? But coal is the most offending fuel. It just shows that there's no simple solution. But which also means that it will be political. It will be political, and political means that something will be achieved. Some divestment will happen, and that's not a bad thing. I go back to the answer I gave to you that there's room for leadership and imagination, and so in a sense, the best thing is that the humans are the most uncertain factor, which has positive implications as well.
So, on behalf of everyone here, I'd like to thank you.
No.